Welcome to OzCast, the platform where we take a deep dive into the science and research behind the issues impacting Australian waterways. Each week, we team up with experts in their field to take a look below the surface. Nick, welcome to OzCast. It's a pleasure to have you here. You're in Dubbo. We're in central, western New South Wales. And I'm really excited about today's episode because we're going to talk about something that I think is missing in mainstream media, missing in a lot of our fishing magazines and the fishing blogs, and that is small-bodied, but not just small-bodied fish, but small-bodied threatened species, which I hear is your expertise. So thanks for coming on.
Yep, pleasure.
It's one of those, topics that I think we need to bring some light to put it that way. You know, I think I actually did hear or read a line from yourself that you were concerned about maybe the lack of attention that some of these species we're going to talk about are given. So, we're going to dive beneath the surface on that. But firstly, anyone who's in the chair opposite me, I'd like to hear a little bit about why their colleagues have kind of thrown them under the bus to be here. So when this topic came up, I put the word out and your name came up straight away. So tell us a bit about your experience, where it kind of started, and then how you find yourself here.
Yep. So, I was born in Hillston, middle of New South Wales, which is on the Lachlan.
Great spot.
And grew up there. Probably didn't come to this profession and trying to save fish like most people. I didn't have that epiphany when I was young. I used to go out yabbing, do a few things like that, but I wasn't a crazed, obsessed child. And then I moved to South Australia when I was quite young. Same sort of thing. Sort of spent some time on waterways, did a few things, but I was actually really into sport, and I wanted to be a sports scientist was desperately what I wanted to do. And then for whatever reason, I think my parents told me, just do science. There's a future in sports.
Lose the sport.
So, exactly. And so I did that, and then it's just evolved from there.
So it wasn't always, you weren't a fishing fanatic like some are.
No. And obviously people you'll talk to, and lots of people that work with fish are when they grow up, but it's just slowly evolved. And now I'm really keen. And I'm particularly keen, as you mentioned, on small-bodied things that people don't sort of appreciate, overlook, and trying to raise their profile and do some stuff with them to conserve them.
So where did you do your studies at?
So Adelaide University, so in South Australia, and then I did a PhD at Charles Sturt in Albury. So I've spent time in Mildura, lived in Albury, all the way along the Murray River, and then now I'm based right at the end of the river in South Australia, Victor Harbour, a little coastal spot near the Murray mouth, which is...
So just on that, I've always been intrigued. The Murray actually runs into the coast, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I know that sounds quite, basic for someone who lives there, but for people, particularly in New South Wales and up, I've got a lot of friends that think it's just never hits the coast type scenario, but it actually does run. And that's where all the carp recently kind of got washed out, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, I think dealing with people around the basin, generally people think the Murray stops at the New South Wales, South Australian border. It doesn't go into South Australia, but it actually does go into South Australia. You got the Murray, and then it hits the lower lakes, so large, expansive lower lakes, and they're really important for a lot of species, a lot of freshwater fish, and then obviously into the Coorong, which is a reverse estuary, so it's saltier the further away you get from the estuary, from the mouth, which is a pretty unique environment. And then the Murray mouth, and the amazing, we go past the Murray mouth for work and take people there, and it's amazing. Like the whole Murray-Darling Basin drains to a mouth that's probably only 100 metres wide. So there's not a massive big delta like you might get with other rivers around the world. It's just...
You'd think it would open up.
Yeah, it doesn't. It shifts a bit, but it's this really insignificant little outlet to the sea. But that connection's important. And I guess the water coming out, it's important for the lower lakes, the Coorong, but also that marine environment. There's lots of species that...
Everything's getting flushed out.
Exactly, rely on it. And I mentioned about the carp. It's been nothing like it this year. The amount of carp, even sort of 40 kilometres around from the mouth, there's been freshwater fish washing up on the beach, and there's been so many around at the moment. It's been...
So is the southern basin, is any of it tidal, like in terms of that salt water pushing up?
It once was, and there is a little bit of tidal influence there, but there's barrages, so they've pretty well cut off the freshwater of the lakes with that marine or the estuary environment. So,
but isn't that super important that you have that mix?
Absolutely, and it absolutely is. And there's now fishways that allow fish to get through there and have that connectivity, because a proportion of the basin's fish spend half their time in the ocean, then come into fresh water and move up. There's lamprey at the moment that are being tracked, I think, almost all the way to Albury. So all the way along the Murray, they're moving up into the system. So for a long time, there wasn't fishways, and that connection was being disrupted.
But even still, for me, fishways allows the fish to go through, but isn't what we're looking for is, that nutrients to mix, the salt water to come up and do its thing for those fish that need that to spawn. Yeah. To me, there is a barrier there.
Yeah. And I guess the reality these days is the amount of flow that's coming down the river is greatly reduced. It might be something like 50%. So if you didn't have the barrages, you'd be consigning all of that freshwater habitat to basically being salty estuary, which might be good for some species, but for a lot of the species we're going to be talking about today, the small-bodied freshwater fish need that freshwater habitat. So if we could restore the volumes of water down the Murray, then you could look at that. But I guess it's the reality of the regulated Murray Basin at the moment. That's not possible.
So when you were studying at Adelaide, what was your PhD on?
My PhD was on Murray cod, actually. Okay. We developed a model, a bioenergetics model, to look at how they use energy and how they function. And it was looking below impoundments, cold water pollution, how that was influencing the growth of the species along the Murray. So, it was pretty interesting. It was a pretty good time as well.
I can imagine. Take you to some cool towns.
Absolutely. So, spent a lot of time up and down the Murray and all through the basin.
How did you then get to small? How did you go from cod to, where did that focus area start to shift?
Well, I guess it kind of, like I'm saying, it just evolved really. I've done big fish stuff, but I guess, so the reality is a lot of the large state organisations, research organisations deal with large body fish, Murray cod, golden perch, and a lot of the gaps really I work for a not-for-profit, is in the small-bodied fish, the things that people don't know about and don't sort of do work on. So that sort of, it evolved that way. And then now, I still do some stuff on Murray cod and golden perch, but majority is on small-bodied. I
was only saying the other day, and tell me what you think. So, picking up what you're putting down there is it's like the bigger fish attract a lot of the attention, I guess all throughout the industry, not just from wreck anglers, but all the way through. But there was somewhat of a blank space with focus on these smaller fish. And the reason I was saying to the other day that the reason I think this is because wreck anglers, just for example, can hone in on the things they want to see, right? They want to catch the big fish. That's what makes the good photos. That's the fun. You can eat them, you can, recreate with them. But the smaller fish, you can't really do any of that. So you can't make tackle for them. You can't fish for them. You can't eat them. So would you agree that, say, sitting here today, there's a considerably probably lack of attention given to these fish, and that's a problem that we need to start fixing in terms of how much we're talking about them, writing about them, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess taking it a step back is a lot of the threatened species focus is on koalas, things with feathers and fur, essentially, and then you get to fish, and then there's a smaller proportion of people interested in fish. The majority of them are on the large-bodied angling species, and then you go down from there, and there's very few people aware or know of these small-bodied species. But it's really important to raise that profile, and I guess part of that is getting them protected. So getting them nationally EPBC listed is really important, but also getting people aware of them. So it's wreck anglers, the community, children. My kids probably some of the only people in Australia that can identify a range of small-bodied species, which most people would go, that might be a little perch, or that might be something, and they can ID it, tell it what it is. And so I guess, and we do lots of work with school groups, and getting them aware of breeding up these species, what's going on with them is really important.
Well, that would be a huge barrier. If you don't know what one looks like, or you see one and you have no idea what it is, then you're less inclined to give two hoots about.
And it's hard to, it's not just the community and wreck fishers, it's managers as well. If they don't understand a species or know much about it, then it's really hard to manage it and do much with it really and care about it.
Yeah, definitely. So threatened species, right? Generally, this is a term that I hear get thrown around a lot, but it's one of many terms that I hear. So, I've heard things from functionally extinct talking about shellfish through to endangered, through to threatened, through to extinct, through to, there's a whole list of them. That I must admit it's confusing, and particularly in an area where we really want to kind of push the public to learn more about this, I reckon probably more clarity can be given around these terms. So what does, threatened actually mean?
So threatened, I guess, you're right, is used quite a lot. It can mean just an informal thing. Well, the species used to be here, but it's under threat. Like every fish in the basin in Australia is generally under some threat. There's a few you can probably think of that aren't, but all of them have reduced in the last 200 years since Europeans have been around. But there is a formal definition of threatened, and I guess it relates to either IUCN, so the international standard for assessing species, or EPBC, the Australian standard, and it can range from critically endangered or vulnerable, and there's certain criteria about how much the population has declined over 3 generations of their life. So there's actually quite a boring formal definition of what it is, but it's really quite important. And over the last 3 years, we've been involved with assessing almost 50 freshwater fish and crayfish against the national standard. So there's a whole scrutiny that goes with it, and it's because there's legal obligations. If a fish is EPBC listed in Australia, then there's protection for it. It impacts what people can do, what developments they can do in its range.
There's probably funding directed towards that.
Absolutely, and that's part of the reason why small-bodied fish and I guess by extension freshwater crayfish have missed out, is they haven't been listed. So like a lot of the funding schemes are linked to the schedule of threatened species. So that's where they missed out. So there's quite formal descriptions of what it means. And they do change a bit. Some escalate if obviously a population's knocked out or they decline.
I'd be interested to hear like how regularly that criteria, for example, or if there's a cycle of assessment, because surely fish would come in and out of that classification. You know, there would be good news stories and there would be, terrible stories around it. So is there a cycle around that, or?
Not really. So it's sort of periodically. A lot of the listings that have been done in the last 2 or 3 years have been disturbance related to the bushfires.
Of course.
And part of that was really getting up to speed with the underrepresentation of listed species. So, but there is somewhat of a process that's evolving to regularly update or assess, not necessarily update, but assess these species. So, and there's some examples of species that were listed quite a while ago: Murray cod, trout cod.
Were they once on there?
They're currently a listed species.
Still.
Yeah.
So that's not public knowledge in my circles anyway.
Yeah. So that's right. And a lot of that was sort of probably 20 years ago or so. And the criteria and the rigorousness of the assessment has changed over time. So now they're going back and they're being reassessed to determine if they still are a valid threatened species. But that aside, I guess, so there's focusing on listed threatened species, formally threatened species, but in any area, there's scope to work on a species, and you can do improvements. Even if a species is relatively common, there's work that can be done to manage that, the habitat for that species, or restock those areas to get, because almost every single species in the Murray-Darling Basin has declined in some extent.
I was going to say, because if you were to judge it off what they were, say, 200 years ago, then other than invasives, of course. But so everything is technically threatened. But there is a classification around that, which I think is really important, because just to hear someone say, it's threatened, is much different than actually being on that list. Like you said, because funding and attention then gets given to that. So is there an opposite to threatened? Obviously carp are in huge numbers, but is there an other end of the scale where you go, well, then? Or is that just pest?
Oh, well, invasive species don't get assessed, but there are native species, bony herring, bony brim, species like that, carp, gudgeon, some small-bodied species that are generalists that are doing okay, and there's a least concern category, which essentially, if they go, then if they're in trouble, then we've lost a lot of species before that, so there's not.
Okay. So they're kind of like, no, they're doing fine.
A lot better. So
that's very good. So, in the fish kills just recently, a lot of, whilst again the big cod and the perch took all the mainstream media, I think the bulk of the fish that died were those, well, not just carp, but those bony brim and things like that. So
exactly right. So that's obviously having an impact, but they're a broad-ranging species. So when you're doing the assessments about the whole of the range, and you've got to get, say, 30% criteria for vulnerable, like population decline over 3 generations or 10 years. So that, again, there's quite a strict criteria. But then once you get, so a critically endangered species, it's a very extreme risk of extinction in the next 10 to 15 years. And then the scale goes down there. So once it's critically endangered, then like without intervention, without help,
it's going.
Yeah, it's going.
Have we lost? Is there any off the top of your head that we've lost? Gone?
In Australia, there's a Pedogalaxis in Tasmania that is being lost from the wild, but ironically, there's a couple of translocated populations where it persists. But in the Murray-Darling Basin, there's Yarra pygmy perch, a small-bodied species that only occurs around the lower lakes that's been lost in the last 10 years.
And that's gone, zip, done.
In the basin. So it still occurs in coastal Victoria. But so it's the first freshwater fish extinction in the basin unless we can do something about it. And we do have backup populations to reinstate it. But it's a pretty big moment for fish in the basin. And I guess in terms of basin plan and what we're doing with trying to restore the basin and fish populations, to have a species lost is not heading in the right direction.
No. Is there any large-bodied fish that are zip gone type thing? Like I know we have threatened, obviously, eastern freshwater cod, the Macca perch, cod, Murray cod, obviously, but there's none that are...
No, not yet. So a lot of them are restricted to you can count on your hand or your hand and your toes, individual populations, which is getting to a point where if you can identify every single population of a species, then it's not doing so well. You'd rather it be more numerous and you wouldn't know where every population is. But no large-bodied species have gone extinct. Yeah,
very good. So on that list of species that you were talking about, the ones that are in the criteria, not the generally threatened ones, do you know how many roughly we've got at the moment, or is the list way too big?
In Australia, there was an IUCN assessment that was done, and it's 37% of all Australian freshwater fish are in one of those threat categories.
Wow.
That's
high.
It is, and that's including obviously Murray-Darling Basin, but coastal Victoria, New South Wales, into WA, South Australia, Queensland, everywhere. But then in the basin, there's 10 currently listed EPBC listed species, and that does include trout cod, Murray cod, silver perch, sort of people may not be aware, but then the small-bodied species that people are definitely probably not aware, or a few people are maybe.
Wow. And then what about, so let's go to small-bodied, I guess, some of those smaller-bodied ones. What are the ones that consume most of your, so when you're going to bed at night, what are the ones that keep you up at night? The ones that you think, well, maybe they're the most famous, or they're the ones that you are most passionate about? Is there a list that you've got there?
Yeah, so a lot of our work is with pretty well 4 main species. So southern purple spotted gudgeon, southern pygmy perch, Yarra pygmy perch, which I mentioned, and then Murray hardyhead. So again, the species that we don't really know, but they were much more widespread than what they are now, occurring numerous wetlands and areas across the southern Murray-Darling Basin. And I guess that's the thing, that the small-bodied species are generally wetland species, so they occur off-channel wetlands, and that's through river regulation of the basin. That's been a huge thing that's been impacted. They're either been lost or they've been permanently inundated, and then there's more competition in those wetlands. So they're not necessarily main channel species always. So it's these off-channel wetlands. Again, another thing wetlands are probably, maybe the appreciation's getting there a little bit, but it's definitely not as great as rivers and areas like that people are aware of.
You're good to pick that up. It's totally cool. We had a microphone drop. But so one thing I must admit, of the species you've mentioned, I've heard of them, which is, and for someone in my industry, that's a good sign, because it means they've been spoken about and they're well documented. I guess still not enough is what they should be, but they have been spoken about. So I guess choosing one, that's, the purple spot, right? So this is one that, well, actually, I'll take a step back and ask you straight off the bat. Why should someone who's never heard of these fish, who's not in our position, care? You know what I mean? Like, to put it bluntly, what the river survives without them, right? And that's a very, negative way to look at it. But for someone who's like, well, I've never heard of this. It wasn't there for me yesterday because I didn't know about it. You've now told me about it. Why do I care?
Yeah, and that's a question. That's probably one of the questions I get most regularly. And in one way, it's very simple to answer, but in one way it's difficult. So I guess the simple answer is they belong there. They were native species. They should be there. And that should really be enough in terms of people caring and people doing something about. But in terms of what other benefits, so small-bodied fish, are consumed by large-bodied fish, so they're a food source as well, even for birds.
Yep.
And I guess they're an indicator of the conditions, obviously. As I mentioned, Yarra perch being lost from the Murray-Darling Basin is not always an indicator. It's not indicating a very good situation. So I guess if with the work we're doing and we're trying to restore parts of the basin, if you can top that off by reintroducing a fish that was once there but hasn't been there for a long time, then it's sort of indicating what you're doing, the habitat, the flow management you're doing, all those kind of things are benefiting. So yeah, I guess
kind of reminds me of water bugs. We do a lot of water bug monitoring at OzFish. It's a great way to get the kids involved. But from my understanding, water bugs are a pretty good indicator of water quality because certain bugs can only tolerate certain things, right? So if you've got a healthy population of small-bodied, gudgeons or whatever it is probably a good indication that, like you said, it tells you more about that particular area of the river. And if they're more healthy in one section, then it's like, right, what are we doing there that's good? Let's replicate that.
Yeah,
is that kind of the idea?
Absolutely. And I guess the in terms of if you're looking at restoring fish populations in general, half the basin's fish are small-bodied. So it would be remiss not to focus on small-bodied fish, the threatened ones, the more common ones as well. Would only focus on larger species because if you're losing a bunch of those small-bodied ones, then that's going to be impacting large-bodied species, the food they can eat as well. But they're an indicator in the same way.
So let's start with one, I guess, the purple spot. Tell us a bit about this species. It's obviously, I think I actually have seen one in a tank, believe it or not, at a hatchery, one of those, you can walk in, you see all these different species. It kind of sat perched on the bottom of a few pebbles there, head up, tail sitting back. It looks like it had, two little arms nearly. But it sat there quite beautiful. That there is spots on there. They were the first thing. Purple, would you believe it or not? But tell us a little bit about this species, particularly kind of your involvement with them, kind of what you like about them or their interesting characteristics.
Yeah. So I guess as you've described, they're for a small-bodied fish, a freshwater fish, they're one of the more attractive ones. So they're a really popular aquarium species as well. So some people may know of them, kept them in the aquarium. But so they're a species that used to be quite common in the Murray-Darling Basin. They actually occur outside of the basin in southern Queensland. So when you're dealing with them in South Australia or Victoria or these areas and you say, oh, we've rediscovered this species or that's happened, people in Queensland go, oh, they're blooming everywhere. Like they're everywhere. So, but I guess in terms of particular habitats, they've been lost. They were found in a couple of locations, basically one of those species, and it's pretty common across the ones we'll be talking about where they're forgotten about, no one really thought. Then they pop up, Cardross Lakes near Mildura in 1997, bit of a population there, and then it dies out.
Right.
And then in where I sort of started to become involved is in South Australia. So a colleague of mine, Michael Hammer, who's done a lot of fish work as well, they were rediscovered in the Lower Murray in 2002, so it hadn't been ever recorded through there. I think the last record was in the 80s in South Australia, rediscovered, and this was just before the millennium drought. So it was, hey, great, we found this species. God. Yeah. And within 5 years, its habitat had dried. So
right. Yeah. So I think it's the word that I'm interested there is rediscovered. So is this a case of a population kind of developing and going well, or is it just a case of humans finding them? You know what I mean? Like, probably we don't know.
Yeah, probably the humans finding it really. And
so they've always been there. It's just a matter of us doing more research around it.
Yeah, exactly. And like things are getting better in terms of just monitoring for threatened species, but we're still finding rare things popping up that you think, how would that ever, like we've been sampling in that area for years and people have been around and no one's ever noticed it. So it gets a little bit back to people not knowing what they are, and they might, oh, that's just a gudgeon, that's just whatever, this different kind of species. But it was actually the local shack owner was dipping around and found this fish and thought, oh, that looks a bit different. And then he contacted a colleague and identified it as a southern purple spotted gudgeon. And from there, it's pretty well, that's been instrumental, that discovery. And then just before the habitat dried during the millennium drought, individuals were taken out, captively bred. We've got backup populations for them, and we've been doing reintroductions from there since that
2002
time.
was that.
Yeah.
Then the drought came through, but that drought was 11 years or something, wasn't it? So that was worst timing ever.
Yeah, exactly.
And then into the early teens, so 2010 onwards.
We've been doing reintroductions in South Australia to specific locations, but they haven't really taken off. So there's probably the odd individual there now, but not that successful. Yeah. But then you fast forward to, I think it was a couple of years ago, and they were found in Kerang Lakes. Just an area was about to be drained for some works, and a person found two more, and they're the ones your listeners may know, zombie fish. So and they hadn't been found in that area for 100 years. So things like that, with all the doom and gloom with fish, you kind of think, how the hell is that staying there? But again, they're quite secretive. They don't move much.
Well, it's not as if they're creating a big, no one's catching them on a line. Right. So it's a matter of stumbling across them. So what about their habitats? What is a prime habitat for?
So I guess a good way of describing them, they're almost like a little mini Murray cod in a way.
Okay.
So that they don't move much. They've got quite a small home range. They just sort of sit out, conserve energy, and then they'll ambush prey, smaller fish, bugs that come by. So they're like really rocky habitats, well vegetated areas along the edge of a waterway. And that's like where they were found in the Kerang Lakes there were reed beds, and within that there was submerged vegetation, and they were just hiding out through there. They can sort of handle low oxygen levels and
so quite resilient.
Yeah, exactly. So again, they were, who knows how long they were there. Whenever you sort of rediscover something, it's like, they just moved there yesterday. And the first thing, I guess, with the purple spotted gudgeon was to make sure that the genetics were remnant, and they weren't from, there is a northern purple spotted gudgeon as well across northern Australia. So I guess to work out it wasn't someone putting them there. Yeah, it was confirmed as the remnant, the guys that are meant to be there.
So the guys that are meant to be there, the guys that aren't meant to be there, would they survive in that area, do you think? Or
possibly, yeah. And we're finding that just generally with fish surveys we're finding a lot of northern species are moving down. One off topic a little bit, but we do a lot of work in the Torrens in Adelaide, and we caught a barramundi once.
No, you didn't.
Right in the middle of Adelaide. So about a 40...
What, electrofishing or something?
Yeah, electrofishing. We were actually trying to remove carp, and a 41 centimetre barramundi. So then you start thinking, well, obviously it hasn't moved there. So someone's put it there. Then you go, well, how long has it been there? Has it been there a couple of winters? Is it a week ago?
Was it healthy?
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. It wasn't looking like it was about to die. But so,
well, someone caught a metre plus barra in the Gold Coast.
Yeah.
No, that was actually caught. And you go, well, Gold Coast is still kind of, but that's pretty far south. If they're there, then what else is following them?
Well, that's exactly right. And so, in general, when we do fish stuff, surveys, you can have a fair idea what's going to be in a spot, but you're never truly sure until you sample it, and rare things like that pull up. But occasionally, populations of threatened fish that you don't sort of anticipate.
So with the gudgeon, what is the biggest issue threatening the gudgeon, or one of?
It's habitat, really. It's getting location. I guess there's a couple. So the recognition, people don't know about them, but also having the numbers. So the issue is it's declined to maybe 1-2 populations if we're lucky. So they're not spreading out, they don't disperse. So we need individuals to release into new habitats, make sure those habitats are secure, and then scale that up really. So we might look at establishing 30 new populations or things like that. And there was one that was established near Mildura in an ornamental lakes. Fish went in there, good conditions, they boomed.
In the town centre there,
in the town centre. And then
I've actually been there. It looks like nothing. There's a cafe nearby.
Exactly
you know
right.
What I mean?
Yeah.
It's not like, this is amazing.
No, that's right. And it's about finding the big thing. There's not other fish in there. There's not predators.
Yeah.
There's a few other fish, but not predators that will eat them. And then the floods came. We all know about the floods, and then they dispersed. We picked up one about 20 kilometres downstream. So it's about getting them back in areas, and then I guess letting that population grow, but also letting them disperse out from there.
And then the habitat being there to support them.
Exactly right. And we're not at the stage yet for any of these species where we can confidently go, well, we've got enough populations that they can do their own thing. We sort of still need to be managing them. But the purple spotted gudgeon find in Kerang is it's a tremendous story. It's amazing that in this day and age, these things can actually still be picked up, and then that's spawned a whole new management of the, like re-establishing them in different populations, backup areas. There's a Melbourne Aquarium exhibit now with purple spotted gudgeon there. Right. So from 2 fish
to now being another.
Yeah, it's starting to work out how we can get them back in that mid-Murray and
I'm always interested in the discovery. Like you said, obviously they got discovered. That's a big moment for the industry, for yourself.
Yeah.
You weren't a part of that as a colleague, right?
Yeah.
So is there been a time, maybe that. What's some of the more significant kind of discoveries, advancements, whatever you want to call them, in this kind of, in this sphere, in this industry, that you've just gone, how? Has there been any that you kind of just go, well, that's me done. I can't explain that type thing. I was speaking to Martin Mullen Cooper on episode 2 of OzCast, and he explained this anecdote of where he was trying to understand, fish traveling from point A to point B, and he used to monitor them 9 till 5 in the lab. Why aren't they moving? Why aren't they moving? This works. And it wasn't until he stayed back late one night, I think it was, turned the lights off, and they went at night time, and he goes, right, that's why, you know what I mean? And it was a real penny dropping moment for him. Is there anything like that in your career that you've had, or
not
that you
so
can
much?
recall?
And even the discoveries of populations and things like that, it's, I don't know, in hindsight, it's like, that's pretty significant. But at the time, you're just sort of retrieving a net, or you're doing this or doing that. It's sort of, you found that. And you sort of know it's important, but it's not like, they creep up on you how significant these things are.
It's not like wake up one morning and see an email.
That's right. Yeah, exactly right. So it's not so much like that. I guess it's not a very, well, it is. It's a fantastic thing to be doing and being out sampling a whole bunch of spots, working on these species, but it's a bit of a gradual process. So it's not like suddenly one day it's, this is a game changer. This has happened. We've solved it. It's more just gradually, and it sounds mundane and a bit boring, but it's gradually working ahead. All right, then there's been this setback, and then you gradually work ahead and sort of move forward. And it feels like that with a lot of these small-bodied fish. There's been work on some of them 20 years, but most likely 10 years, and we're slowly building momentum where it used to be every project was like a trial project, and we'll trial this, see if it works, but we're getting past that stage where it's sort of being a bit more ingrained in management agencies and people who are working on them, that we're sort of moving beyond that and getting to a bigger scale. So
is there just before we move off the issues threatening these species, is there any issue around invasives, where it be trout, redfin, any of them posing a serious threat, or are they the one species that are kind of like, you can live with them?
No, if you've seen a little purple spotted gudgeon, look, if I was a fish that ate other fish, I'd want to eat it. It's a little tasty little thing. So trout are a big issue for some threatened species up in the mountains and various spots, but I guess around the lower lakes and areas I work, it's redfin. So again, people often don't know that they're an introduced species. They're a good angling species, but they can get to eating other fish at about 9 centimetres. So that can be within like 8 months, they can get to a predatory size to be eating these small body fish. And we're talking about some fish that may only grow to 5 or 6 centimetres that we're trying to protect. So
perfect meal size, they fall within that window that you kind of like, sorry, mate.
Exactly right. And it's not like the big redfin 30 centimetres plus have an impact, but it's often some of the smaller ones that they get to that stage, but they can get into different little areas, different little habitats, and they can be consuming what we're trying to save.
Is disease a problem? Because I know redfin, the big one with redfin is they carry that disease, EHF or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. We haven't sort of found too many issues with disease. There's a few issues with genetics, like understandably populations that declines are small don't have the best genetics, but there's been a lot of work on that as well. But there generally hasn't been too many diseases in a couple of these species that we've been dealing with. Well, it's not as big a problem as some of the other threats about habitat or predation that they face.
So before we move on to the next species I want to chat about, purple spot. As we sit right now, we're looking good. Are we work to do? And if so, what's the big thing you want to see?
Yeah, I guess with any of these, we're not necessarily looking good, but I guess the important thing is we're moving in the right direction. So it's trending there's work on them. We sort of have a greater appreciation of what's needed. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy or it's job's done, but we definitely sort of are moving in the right direction, I should say, with some of these species. So it's about finding new backup populations, building those numbers up, and then finding wild sites that we can release them into. And I guess appreciating that it's not an overnight thing. You can't just put them in a spot and forget about it. You've got to manage that site. They may not take, and finding a range of different sites, to get them back. But
I'll be interested to check in, maybe, 5 years time and see, okay, how are we looking from the last time, we spoke. I always like to see, who knows, there might be another of those discoveries in the next few years, which would be awesome. I want to move on, if we can. One of these the big four, I'm going to call them, that you spoke about, I'm going to assume that a lot of they're similar size, right? Similar size, small-bodied fish. So surely their habitats are very similar. The story is kind of the same amongst a lot of these. Maybe the pygmy perch, for example, is there any interesting characteristics around that differs from the purple spot?
Not so much, but yeah, you're right. They're similar sort of freshwater habitats to the purple spotted gudgeon. I guess purple spotted gudgeons are probably more up and down the Murray historically. There's two pygmy perch species, southern pygmy perch, quite broadly distributed, goes all the way up to the high country historically through the Murray section and then down to the lower lakes, and the tributary streams of the Mount Lofty ranges that flow into the lower lakes. And then there's Yarra pygmy perch, which was only discovered in 2002. The similarities, I guess, with these species is not much known about them, declined a lot. Then millennium droughts came along, and the lower lakes went 1.5 meters below sea level, so that the fringing habitat would bone dry. So that's obviously not a good sign for species that need those habitats. So
and again, what's the threats around the pygmy perch? Very similar.
Habitat, redfin are an issue down in the lower lakes in some of their areas, but a big threat is just the way that populations decline, that they're not getting to these new spots. There is an interesting thing with the pygmy perch. So it's like compare the pair in a way. With post millennium drought, we did reintroductions of both Yarra pygmy perch and the southern pygmy perch into the lower lakes. The pygmy perch established, and it's one of the, for a small-bodied fish, or even for any fish really, it's such a successful reintroduction project where it went from being lost to the lower lakes region to re-establishing, getting to new sites, populations increasing. It took 10 years to occur off relatively small reintroduction number of individuals. So it's a good testament of what can be done. And we don't quite know what the condition, if it was, we just fluked the right time to release them and it worked. There's still a lot of that. It's sort of unknown for a lot of these species. But comparing to Yarra pygmy perch, similar thing, small number of fish released in different habitats. And haven't established. So they might have established for a couple of years and then lost. Then we did a couple more releases, and they just haven't taken for whatever reason.
So to me, it's about them basically breeding and expanding that population. So let's say you had a small one, and it's about expanding that initial one themselves, not with any human intervention. Is there any conditions that are stopping them from breeding? Are they the type of species that, for example, golden perch or yellow belly swim upstream and then, let their larvae drift down, or we don't know anything about that yet?
No, they don't sort of function on that very localised scale, but there's not much known about these. So where we're thinking, they were in this habitat, we think it's pretty good. Again, we'll reintroduce them, maybe do some habitat restoration or get some flows in there and then release them. We're still a bit of a black hole in terms of what the species is doing, what their requirements are, that sort of basic understanding of the species.
Does that excite you as a scientist, fish ecologist, whatever, anyone working in this field? Does black holes excite you in terms of we've got something to look, we've got something to focus our attention on here type? To me, that would be an exciting kind of discovery in that sense, that go, right, we don't know anything about this. Let's do what we can to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in a way it's we don't know that. It's not working, unfortunately. So your end game is you're not getting to there. So then you have to go back and work it out. And yeah, absolutely. There's lots of people, scientists particularly, think about things probably too much about why things aren't working, why things are doing. And I guess one thing we've done with them, like just putting them in a fish tank at home and having both species, the southern pygmy perch, the one that did succeed and re-establish, goes okay and the numbers stay right. Putting same number of Yarra pygmy perch in there for whatever reason, they're not necessarily fighting or competing, but the numbers just dwindled. And I guess that's probably, there's something like in that, we haven't been able to investigate it, but there's probably something like in that we're not aware of and we haven't sort of cracked what it is. But it's a fairly simple process. Like if you put them in a farm dam in an area without other predators and secure water, the numbers boom. So
like in Mildura.
Yeah, exactly. And we've had Yarra pygmy perch backup populations where I remember putting my hand in the water, crystal clear, and just grabbing one with my hand. They were that thick. And this is a species that's not in the wild at the moment in the Murray-Darling Basin. And you might catch 3,000 or 4,000 in a night in this backup population, but then you translate that to the wild and there's something going on that's not allowing them to establish. But it's very similar looking species is establishing. So there's a bit there that we need to unpack.
Yeah, good luck to you.
Exactly right. We haven't quite got there, but yeah.
Can we learn anything from overseas? Is there? I know they're native in some respects, but that doesn't mean you can't have a native species somewhere else. So is there a similar species or a similar story that we know from a different country? Because obviously we're such a young country in our being civilized. So nothing from neighbouring, or there is?
No, there is, So in 2019, I received a Churchill Fellowship and I travelled overseas just before COVID, which was good. And
timing.
Yeah, I went to a couple of spots and there's a species called the Oregon chub. It occurs in Oregon, near Portland.
Weird that.
Yeah, very. And the guy that works on it, his name is Brian Bang. So there's a few weird things going on there, but it's a species that was nationally listed in America. And they just, same sort of thing, gradually just established new populations and were able to get it delisted in America. So I was able to meet with him and we just talked about, like, a lot of the stuff we're doing is similar and it's working. But I guess the thing that stands out there is just that long-term commitment. So there's going to be, with threatened species, you're dealing with low numbers, you're dealing with lots of threats. So it's just maintaining that continual effort on them. And some years will be good, some years won't be bad.
So they're in a position that we were in terms of, there's a population, it's gone. Here is another one that's expand that. And eventually they got there because obviously they've been around for, they've been working on it for longer. So to me, that's that gives you a bit of a, thumbs up to say that if we keep doing what we're doing, we will get there. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we're talking about black holes, things we don't know, but we know so much more about these species than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We obviously now know that there are species and where they are and what they need in some aspects. So it's just, again, it's just continually working on these things, like most things. If you commit to it and do effort over a long time, you're going to find out things. You're going to have little moments where you work out something that works and you've been doing it another way another time. It might just be the way we release that species or where we put them. Like we've put them in soft release enclosures to give them a bit of time, but maybe we need to do something different. Maybe it's the habitat. We're going to spots where they once occurred, assuming that's now good habitat again, but maybe we need to rethink that and go to different areas. And but again, it's just having that long-term commitment on them, and that's the challenge. And does it ever occur to you that there's species that we haven't discovered yet? Well, lots of them potentially. There has to be, in my eyes. You might know more. That it's going to pop up one day. You're going to go, "What the hell is this?" Then it's going to be another one that we've got to try look into, and is surely in your field that's an exciting prospect. Yeah, absolutely. It's exciting / daunting again because you think, well, we've got this number of threatened species and we can't deal with them. And we've done a bunch of work on the spiny crayfish. So there's 54 described species, and we've done some genetic work that indicate there might be another 20. And that's a pretty common thing for different fish groups as well. So I guess it's the power of the technique to be able to resolve different species and the like. So yes, there's definitely things that are propping up in terms of new species all the time. But I guess the other thing, back to the point about the purple spots, is we're finding the species we know popping up in new areas, and suddenly that's a new avenue for protecting them or working on the species. So things will pop up, and the floods are a good example of things moving around. It can be invasive species, or it can be those. I was going to say, floods could be a benefit.
Absolutely.
had this conversation with Martin. I think sometimes in the mainstream media, floods are advertised as being the worst thing ever. Yeah. But surely if we're trying to push this population of where it be purple spot or pygmy perch along, the one way to do it is a good flush.
Absolutely.
You know, is that...
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that we've got a trade-off. We know there might be 5 populations we know of, and we can manage 2 of them, keep them immune from the flooding or unimpacted, and so we know they're secure, but the other 3 we don't.
See what happens.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a risk where you're letting them go out to maybe never see again, but we do see them, and it's part of like the natural life history is to, back in the day, they would have been in little areas occasionally, that might have dried, they might have moved to this new one. So it's about having enough populations where you're confident enough to go, well, let them, set them free and let them do their own thing if flooding occurs, or if you can connect them up.
I'm intrigued about this insurance policy that we can continue coming back to, which is obviously having a safe population there. Obviously it makes sense. Take a few away, keep them there, because if we ever need to reintroduce them, then we can just continue to grow that out. Yeah. What's to say that you couldn't take, say, the purple spot, develop, like you said, you know, that place where you're putting your hand in the water and lifting it up, and you said there was thousands, just continue to grow that and grow it and grow it and grow it to the point where there is like millions. Yeah. Drop them in. Now, here's me trying to come up with ways to solve this, but I'm trying to think logically. Drop them in various spots, and the ones that survive, well, that's the conditions that they need, you know? Yeah.
And that's really important. So that, I guess it's in a way it's production. So that's important. So the trout cod story of recovering from a lot of areas, I think it was something like 2 million fish went into being restocked. Yeah. And in America, there's a Rio Grande silvery minnow, and they've done like 2 million individuals over 10 years. So it's, when we don't know everything, that black box about why they're taking in a spot, it's a more fish more often is a motto to use. And so we're not there in terms of the numbers, having that production. We can't confidently say, all right, we've got 20,000 of this species that we can put to different areas, and some they won't establish, some they will, and then they'll move. So we're not quite at that stage. So a big part of what is going on for these species is securing getting secure backup populations. So they can be anywhere from farm dams, constructed wetlands. We've got one down near us that's a development, but they've got a whole network of constructed wetlands that we've got 3 different threatened species just being managed, semi-managed in there.
So constructed wetlands as in they're obviously not natural, and you're adding the elements that you want to add into that. So can you construct like a good riparian zone? That
you can.
And you could technically just expand that, because that's one of the big things. Obviously, these small-bodied fish need a strong riparian zone. We know that. So it's kind of interesting that we're starting to basically manufacture them out of nothing.
Exactly, because you can go to the production where you do it all in a hatchery, do that. But for a lot of these species, that doesn't work as well. And you can just put them into these. If you get the conditions right and it is secure water, no other predators, nothing else impacting it, you can really get good populations going. And then it's about managing each one and managing the landholder or the manager, and then harvesting off those populations. So we're definitely doing that, but I guess it's that scaling up, getting to the stage where we have maybe 50 of them around the landscape that we're utilising from time to time. And some years there'll be some issue, they won't be going that well, but you've got another 5 in that area you can harvest individuals off and release to a spot. So, and because again, they've declined to patchy populations, could be a couple of 100 kilometres more away from each other. They're not naturally dispersing. And I guess that's the reintroduction thing, is people go, oh, well, if they were meant to be there, they would be there. Why do you need to reintroduce them? But given the drought, things that have happened over 200 years, then they're not going to be there, and they're not moving anytime soon. So it's about reintroducing back to these spots and having those individuals to put there.
You mentioned it before, crayfish. We can restock the water too if we need. To kind of round it out, this last example we've got, you do a lot of work in and around that. it is considered a threatened species, if that makes
even
though it's not a fish in it,
yeah.
It is still a marine species that we need to focus on. So tell us a little bit about that, your work, but why we should be why we need to know about this as a species, some of its interesting characteristics.
So we're going through that triage of threatened species from koalas all the way down. Crayfish, freshwater crayfish particularly, are even probably lower than freshwater fish in terms of recognition and understanding. And so there's Murray crayfish, which people probably know about, which is the second largest freshwater crayfish in the world. But there's another 53 euasticus or spiny crayfish around Australia. They go all the way from South Australia all the way up to Cairns, above Cairns, sort of in the high country there. And they're quite threatened. Some of them are really small populations. We don't know very little about them. We know where they occur. We know they're a species, but we don't know much else. But in terms of Murray crayfish is an example of those species. It's a species people recreationally fish and still can in Victoria and parts of New South Wales. But it doesn't do itself any favours. So it takes 6 or 7 years plus to reach maturity. It's just
that's long.
Slow growing. So it might live for 30 years, but it just gradually grows. So in terms of impact, the rescues, blackwater events are a big impact. Them crawling out the water.
Well, that's the big indication, isn't it? When we know, okay, something's up here. When you see them crawling out of the water, some of the imagery that came from late last year, I think it was November or October or something, they were the first ones to leave.
Absolutely, and that's a bit of a strategy they do. If it's bad water quality for a couple of days or a couple of hours, they can survive that, get out of the water, come back in, occasionally go back out. But often it's not the case. So the big blackwater impact was after the drought. Then we had the 2010-11 flooding, which was a huge impact, and it was over summer. Blackwater extended for 6 months almost across a lot of the Murray crayfish range. So this is species was once common all the way down to Murray Bridge in South Australia, through the Murray, through New South Wales, Victoria. There was a commercial fishery for a while in South Australia and New South Wales, and then recreationally fished, but river regulations impacted them. They need fast flowing, turbulent water. Lots of things have impacted them. And then 10 years ago, the blackwater sort of started being noticed, the impacts, and then there's been a couple of events since then, and the one obviously most recently that you mentioned. So they're not doing themselves any favours, and we definitely haven't helped them. But so there's a bunch of things that can be done there in terms of flow, potentially regulating the recreational fishery, but also, again, coming back to translocations has been really important, and we've done a successful one in New South Wales, 5 years of releases of individuals, and we're noticing them population increasing, but also slowly spreading out from that site. So there's things that can be done with them. And then if you also look at further afield, so we're looking at, and we've just completed the first releases into South Australia. So they were once there, common, no records since the 80s. And then so 40 years later, we've managed to reintroduce them back there. So,
but translocation for me, well, is that the process of humans doing it?
Yeah, so translocation's a sort of a catch-all that covers reintroductions, reinforcement. So people use them interchangeably, but essentially they mean the same thing.
Unlike fish, though, how are crayfish naturally going to, establish new populations? Because excuse the ignorance, but they're not swimming.
No, they're crawling. So,
but that takes a much longer.
A long time. So that's another thing. We're confident they're not getting there anytime soon.
They don't have a lot going for them, do they?
No. Well, if you've ever seen one or had one grab your finger or anything, they've got a fair bit going for them.
Yeah, they're
massive, indestructible shells, but in terms of surviving in the current modern world, they're not really equipped to it. So they need some help.
So you mentioned a few of the major threats there. Obviously, they're big enough to not be. Are they predated on by fish like Murray cod and things like that? Yeah,
definitely smaller. But once they get to we may be.
I was going to say if they're the second biggest in the world, freshwater cray in the world, that's quite. So
they get to almost 2 kilos, and they get probably 45 centimeters their whole length. So nothing's messing with them at that size. But the smaller individuals definitely, and when they grow by molting, so they'll just basically jump out of their shell, and they're soft as jelly when that happens. So they're really vulnerable at that stage. So
slurp straight up.
Exactly right. So you can definitely imagine that happening. But again, once they get big white claws, and all of the spiny crays do have claws. Like some of them almost grow to 5 centimeters. They're really, really small, but a lot of them are reasonably big and pretty impressive where they occur, and there's all different colours and different habitats. And
one of the things I always like asking people, particularly like yourself in the industry, is like, are you optimistic about the future of the health of particularly the Southern Basin? Where are you at from we're moving away, let's move away particularly just from threatened small-bodied, but more generally, like where do you sit?
Yeah. So I oscillate. Some days I'm very optimistic, like we've had a good success, we sort of understand what's going on, but then other days you sort of have setbacks. And I guess, again, getting back to that gradual moving forward, that's kind of the way. So when something amazing happens, you establish a population, you go, well, that wasn't there. Without us doing that, that species wouldn't be in this area, and it's taking off. It's great. And you think, well, if we can just scale that up again to different spots, but then when you have a fish kill or a blackwater event or various other things that impact them, it's like, I don't know what's going to happen here. But so I guess, sitting on the fence a little bit there. I'm generally positive, and I think we can do stuff. And we know so much more, even when we don't know everything about these species. We know a lot more than we once did. And we can start being a little bit more strategic about where we put them and how we don't just put them in a spot to reintroduce them. We actually put them there, but we've done some work to get the habitat right. We can manage that site, maybe remove predators for a time to get them established. So I guess I am, but in terms of reduced flows and increasing temperatures in terms of climate change is a bit of an issue, and like we have to do it now, but even more in the future, we'll have to manage for the bad times. So it's okay to get a population established, but if there's a drought coming, how do we work out how to manage that population?
There, You can do all this great work and then just go on within one event.
Yeah, and so it's about picking spots that are somewhat drought-proof, and having the backup populations. And you may go, well, we had 20 years and we've established it in these areas. Drying conditions have come and we've lost them in 5, but we've got a backup population so we can put more out there, and then you're slowly moving forward. These things are gradual.
And what role do conservation organisations, non-for-profits, and I guess the rec angling community, would you like to see greater recognition, more awareness around what species you're looking at? That it is threatened. Okay, it's threatened. I've seen it here. Let's report that. Is there a role that they can play?
Absolutely. And I work for a not-for-profit, but I also work closely with lots of state agencies, government agencies, and they're doing a tremendous job with a lot of things. But a lot of the work we've done has been pushed by the community or people outside of that don't necessarily need to have to worry about it, but they're passionate, they want to do something, and that's where it's happened from, and they've really been driving it. So if community or rec fishers or anyone is interested in something, they can push it, there's opportunities, they can partner up with people. So I think it's huge. Like it's the way to get things done. A lot of the threatened species stuff, it comes back to individuals, and you talk to people, and there's people who've been doing it for 40 years, and they could have taken an easy option and worked on something less stressful, but they're passionate about that species or that collection of species, and that's without them keeping the effort going. There might be years when they don't have any funding or they don't have any resources, but they just keep it going, and then there'll be periods when there is government involvement, funding, and we are sort of getting past that stage, but I can't really.
It's good to know that someone's sticking up for the little guys, if that makes sense. It's great to know that people like yourself are focusing on them, because there's plenty of people that are, but hopefully anyone listening to this can now develop an appreciation for these species, understand the role they play. You put that pretty plainly there that we need to be focusing on these, and then understand, what can be done, how can we help, and go from there. I didn't think we were going to, fill an hour, I guess, on a species that doesn't necessarily, attract any mainstream media traditionally, but it's great to know. Thanks for coming on. If you have is there a message you have for anyone listening to this as to, maybe is it just go do a bit of reading? Is it is it join, an organisation or a non-for-profit that's working in this area? Is there a bit of a call to action you've got for someone who's now interested in this stuff?
I guess it's don't forget the little guys, don't forget these species and not just the little fish, but the crayfish that people don't know about. So there's a new Murray-Darling freshwater fish book coming out, guidebook. There's a similar crayfish one of Australia. And if nothing else,
read it.
Read it and just look at the species and just go, wow, like some of the crayfish are bright red, some of them are all these like different locations. So just, have an appreciation of these guys being there. And I guess if you're interested in your area, or you have an area that might be a good backup population, a good farm dam, there's local agencies to get in touch with now that like it would be, I don't have a dam, unfortunately, on my property, but it would be an amazing thing to know. And we sort of feel that by extension because we're looking after these backup populations. But to have a nationally threatened species in your dam that you're protecting is a pretty important thing to do. So, there you go. There's lots that can be done.
Don't forget the little guys. I think if there's one line you're going to remember from the episode, that is it. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure, Nick. Thanks for coming on. I believe you're due back for another talk on this tomorrow, which is great to see the momentum kicking on. Thanks for joining OzCast.
Pleasure.
This podcast has been assisted by the New South Wales Government through its Environmental Trust in partnership with the New South Wales DPI Fisheries and BCF, Boating, Camping, Fishing.